carnival time in New Orleans, when the city explodes with color and sound and people go wild. But for one person, New Orleans holds a different kind of magic. Judith Very Baker first came here in April 1963, 7 months before Kennedy's assassination in Dallas. She fell deeply in love with a man she met here, who was to change her life forever. That man was Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Oswald was an innocent man who gave his life for his country, who was a loyal Marine to the very end, and he deserves better in history than the vile portrait of him that's been painted. This is a man who is a hero, and I stand as a witness to that. Period.
Judith's story, told here for the first time, changes forever our understanding of Lee Harvey Oswald and his role in history. That story begins in Bradenton, Florida, where as a young schoolgirl Judith excelled in science, as her sister Linda explains.
By the time she was in high school, she was extremely dedicated to her work. And when I say to her work, it was her scientific studies, her projects that she worked on. And she always had this interest in cancer research. She wanted to be the person who could cure cancer, and she was determined to do that.
Her exceptional abilities were soon drawing local and then national attention.
When I was in high school, I noticed that I was focusing on things that were of interest to the military. My work with cancer, my work with getting metal out of seawater and all that, excited a great deal of interest. I gave lung cancer to mice faster than it had ever been done before with all their big labs and everything else. They were astonished. And they even went to my school and checked everything out, and of course I had all the proof. All the doors opened from there. I found myself invited as soon as I could graduate. I was sent to Buffalo, New York, to the oldest and most prestigious, at that time, cancer research center in the United States, Roswell Park Memorial Institute for Cancer Research, under the auspices of Dr. Deal and Dr. Ochsner.
Dr. Alton Ochsner, one of the world's leading cancer specialists, was fiercely anti-communist. He was to play a crucial role in Judith's life. Without realizing it, she was being subtly drawn into clandestine research work. This became apparent in 1962, when she became a full-time student at the University of Florida in Gainesville.
I was getting specialized in deadly cancers. It was made clear to me by the time I entered the University of Florida, they didn't want people knowing that we were working on projects that might have to do with eventually competing with Russia on the matter of using cancer as a bioweapon.
She was very gullible. She didn't have people experience. She was always in a laboratory working. So yeah, she was very capable of being taken advantage of without ever knowing it until it was too late.
In the spring of 1963, Judith was invited to join Dr. Ochsner in New Orleans on a temporary assignment. It was an exciting offer for the young scientist. The Ochsner Clinic and its founder were world-renowned.
Dr. Alton Ochsner, who was famous as the first physician to link smoking and cancer, and who had many military and government connections, he said he needed me there and that he wanted me to work in the bone cancer lab with Dr. Mary Sherman. Dr. Mary Sherman was working on some cutting-edge research, and the blood sedimentation work I was doing they thought would be valuable. On top of that, he'd been telling me what to do for a couple of years now and was interested in everything I was doing. This man was virulently anti-Castro, and he knew about my anti-Castro feelings.
Judith arrived in New Orleans on April 20th, 1963, 2 weeks before she was to meet Ochsner. She was a naive 19-year-old, alone for the first time in a big city. She was to be joined 10 days later by her fiancé, Robert Baker. While she awaited his arrival, Judith took a room at the YWCA, close to the downtown area. The following week, she went to the main post office to pick up a letter from her husband-to-be.
As I asked for the letter from Robert Baker and obtained it, when I reached for it, I dropped the newspaper, and this very clean cut young gentleman standing behind me picked it up and handed it back. I looked at him, and he smiled, and he's young like I am, and he was so clean cut and so polite that when he asked me if he could walk me home, I said yes. That was how I met Lee Harvey Oswald for the first time. I have to call it instant chemistry. I never felt such an attraction for anyone, either then or ever in my life since. It was love at first sight, and I know he felt the same way about me too.
New Orleans was Oswald's hometown, and overnight he became Judith's guide and protector. The first person he introduced her to was a man he called Dr. David Ferry, a close friend. They met in a local restaurant.
He was wearing an airline captain pilot's hat, and he had his pilot's jacket on and a ring, and here I'd been told he was Dr. David Ferry, but now I also realized he was Captain David Ferry, had been with Eastern Airlines. This is a man who probably could talk to you on any subject at length. He could discourse on anything, and he could speak knowledgeably to me about cancer research even. He was actually, he said, working on a project. He would like me to see it. He knew who Ochsner was. He not only knew Dr. Mary Sherman, she was his friend. So all of these things were of great interest to me. I wanted very much to know more about this strange man, Dr. David Ferry, who was also the captain.
Later that day, Oswald took Judith to David Ferry's apartment in this suburb of New Orleans. Unwittingly, she was being drawn into a deadly game.
David Ferry's apartment was the upper half of a white Spanish-style building, and we entered from the back. People who knew David Ferry would not enter from the front. So as we sat down, and we're sitting down on an antique piece of furniture from his mother. He has nice chintz curtains, but the rest of it looks like 6 or 7 garage sales all slammed together. He had a book on nursing and surgical procedures, how to do operations. He had the DIFCO manual, and nobody has the DIFCO manual unless they're doing cancer research or other kinds of tissue culture and so on. We were there not only most of the day, but all night long that night. And I took reams of notes on what he was saying.
To Judith's amazement, Ferry began to talk about a secret government medical project against Castro, involving himself and Mary Sherman, overseen by Alton Ochsner.
I knew that Dr. Ochsner had been working on a variety of different projects, and that because of his association with anti-Castro people such as David Ferry, this seemed very possible to me that Dr. Ochsner and Dr. Sherman might be involved with David Ferry. And of course he spoke knowledgeably of both people.
However, following a raucous party at Ferry's apartment, Judith began to have reservations about her exotic new friends and their wild claims.
I was already falling in love with Lee Oswald, but I didn't know him that well. So I was concerned, and I asked Lee to show me. I need to find out, really, is the government really involved in this? I might be being lied to. I hadn't even met Dr. Ochsner yet and wasn't supposed to for another few days.
To reassure Judith of his official status, Oswald took her downtown to meet another close associate, Guy Bannister, a former FBI man now operating as a private investigator.
There on the wall, there it was. This man was the head of the FBI in Chicago. He carried a beautiful big gun right there on his shoulder holster. He had all kinds of credentials, and he affirmed that Lee was working on an anti-Castro project. That was good enough for me.
Judith was even more impressed when Lee later took her to the 3rd floor of Bannister's building, where she saw assorted military equipment stored.
Lee told me that he was in New Orleans for several reasons. One of them was to make a training film, and that he was working with these anti-Castro insurgents to help teach some of these young Cubans how to use ammunition, how to, do their guns, how to fire, and all that. He was part of this, but he had several other projects he was also working on. He was a very busy man there.
Less than a week in New Orleans had turned Judith's life upside down. With the arrival of her fiancé, Robert Baker, she faced a difficult choice.
I knew I was falling in love with Lee Oswald, and I knew Lee was falling in love with me. And yet I had strong feelings for Robert Baker, whom I'd known for 10 months. Lee told me at that time that he had beaten his wife, Marina, and he was sorry, and we talked about that, and I told him that that was really disgusting to me. And I had wanted nothing to do with anyone who was violent. I believe if Lee had not told me that, I don't believe I would have married Robert Baker.
But she did. Robert had found lucrative employment in the Gulf of Mexico and had one day in which to marry Judith. Work came before romance.
On May 3rd, he kisses me, we have a wonderful tumble in bed, and then he's gone. And he'll be gone for weeks.
Left alone in New Orleans, the newlywed needed secure accommodation. Lee came to her rescue with a convenient rental property.
Lee Oswald moved me into 1032 Marengo Street on May 4th, 1963, and we spent most of the day getting me accommodated. He even brought 4 begonias to put in the windows. Nobody knows, they say, what Lee Oswald was doing on May 4th, but I do. The most important entrance to 1032 Marengo was here in the back. And next to this door in the back is a window and windowsill where we kept the key so that Lee could get in whenever he needed to. The owner of 1032 Marengo was a widow named Susie Hanover. She had the back half, we had the front half. And she was so kind as to warn me and Lee if someone was coming. She liked Lee very much and had known him for a long time, apparently, from the time he had been a young person growing up here in New Orleans.
Shortly after moving in, Judith had a meeting with Alton Ochsner at this hospital, her first since arriving in New Orleans. She did not go alone.
Lee accompanied me there and told me that he had to go in first to talk to Dr. Ochsner. This made me recognize that he had already had a prior association with Ochsner. When I went in, Dr. Ochsner began to explain to me, and I'd already been apprised a great deal more by Dr. David Ferry, about the project that he had been working on for over a year. And this clearly had to do with working with these deadly cancer strains that he knew I was well adept at handling. The idea was to try and get Castro ill, very ill, and eliminated through what seemed a natural cause, in this case, cancer. The attractiveness of the plan that Dr. Ochsner and Dr. Sherman and David Ferry were working on is that up to now, attempts to kill Castro had to involve some kind of violence that could be traced to some country or individual. And that could lead to war. World War III, maybe, if Russia intervened. This was considered, in my mind, a noble experiment, a noble attempt to do away with Castro without anyone getting blamed or with only a few people being involved, because it was biomedical. At any rate, at the end of the summer, he promised me that I would skip 2 years of school and go directly into medical school at Tulane Medical School. Of course, how could I say no?
Having agreed to join the Kill Castro medical team, Judith and Lee were assigned cover jobs at the Riley Coffee Company in downtown New Orleans.
Rain or shine, Lee and I would get off the bus and we'd walk this way to go to Riley Coffee Company in the morning. And what we would do is go through these doors. He would go that direction to the right, to the shipping and packing and where the machinery was and the roasters. I would go to the left, up into the executive suites where I worked as a secretary for Mr. Monahan.
These payslips and this tax statement confirm Judith's employment at Riley's. However, her real work lay in David Ferry's apartment. Incredibly, this simple kitchen had been turned into a secret laboratory. It was here that Judith, often assisted by Lee, helped develop the deadly virus, ultimately intended for Castro.
It was my job to work with 50 to 60 mice at a time, and these mice had large tumors that had developed. They were being brought in from another nearby locale, some other place. Now, these animals had already been inoculated with cancer when they were weanling mice, very, very tiny. And in a matter of a week or so, the cancer that they had developed at this time, the lumps and the tumors were as large as these little mice. So to the point where they could hardly drag these huge tumors along. And we would actually have to kill these mice, cut out the tumors, weigh the tumors, see which ones were the the heaviest, because those were the fastest growing. We were interested in the weight and how fast these tumors grew. We were after a vicious cancer, a galloping cancer. And all the tumor material that seemed to be most vigorous was then placed in a blender and blended together so they could recycle and not lose that virus. And the other thing that we were doing was making tissue cell cultures from the most vigorous and deadly cancers.
Judith regularly took these materials and her reports from Ferry's lab to Dr. Mary Sherman's apartment in a smart part of town.
Down there is St. Charles Street, where the streetcar would just drop me off, and then I had a 1-minute walk down this little corridor here and went in here, crossed into where these people are entering, and went inside, and inside is a nice courtyard, and I entered Mary Sherman's apartment. And I usually drop things off. Sometimes I would stay there and read and wait for her to come. Dr. Mary Sherman was not a person who was anything but gracious and an honorable lady in every sense. I never felt like she was someone who had any vices at all. I felt these contacts were necessary so that there would be some way for her to report on my work and what I was doing as if I were some kind of student working under her anyway, so I could go into Tulane in the fall, which was still the plan.
Mary Sherman secretly carried out vital work on the bioweapon at another location. Oswald was the go-between.
The work that we were doing, without Lee Oswald, it couldn't have been accomplished. He was able to actually move materials over to the U.S. Public Health Center over near the Crippled Children's Hospital, where often Mary Sherman would meet him, and they were exchanging materials all the time. They were using a linear particle accelerator, atomic radiation, to change the genetic components in the virus that we were working with. I was never there myself personally, but I understood that what I was getting was altered genetically in certain ways.
Confined to her kitchen lab, Judith was to spend many hours in Ferry and Oswald's company. One day they introduced her to an old friend.
We had been talking about my dog Sparky the day before. Sparky was a bad little dog who went on my bed. They said they wanted to introduce me to another Sparky, also a dog who couldn't control himself. And this individual's name, they said, was Sparky Rubenstein. Only much, much later did I learn that this was Jack Ruby, and I never connected the two when Lee was murdered. He was very interested in what we were doing there in the lab, and David Ferry openly showed him what was going on, which surprised me. And then he turned his attention to Lee and mentioned some things that showed me that he had known him for quite a while, including a remark made to me. I've known him ever since he was a little boy, when he was at parties and things like that. That's the way he put it.
No official investigation into Kennedy's assassination has found any connection between Ruby and Oswald. In May 1963, Oswald moved into an apartment on Magazine Street, a short walk from Judith's. He was joined from Dallas by his pregnant wife Marina and their baby daughter June.
From time to time, if he had an argument with Marina, he would simply go to my apartment, which was about 7 blocks away as the crow flies. As this was a very busy street, we could get on a bus at any time, and of course we did. We rode the bus, the magazine bus, to and from work at Riley, and so we saw each other daily. We really locked in with a lot of affection. We enjoyed each other's company. The traction was incredible, and a lot of it was chemistry. A lot of it was just personality. Lee and I tried not to sleep together because of our marriage obligations. But the fact is it was a losing battle. And between Lee's disappointment with Marina and my disappointment with my husband, and the tremendous attraction we had for each other, we just couldn't bear it anymore. We found such great pleasure in just being together.
Why not?
Clay Shaw, a close confidant of Ochsner's and a leading New Orleans businessman, helped the young lovers. Later, he was to go on trial for conspiring to kill Kennedy, only to be acquitted.
Clay Shaw felt sorry for Lee and me, so he set up so we could actually go to a few hotels. And at each time we went into separate rooms. But at those times we had all the room service, we had food, and we had privacy, and this is in the afternoons. So I mean, he was always home by night, but we couldn't help ourselves. Lee Oswald was a man who was attractive to me, not only physically, but also intellectually. We enjoyed our music, we enjoyed talking, and we enjoyed being in bed together with each other.
As the young lovers were drawn deeper into Alton Ochsner's project, they became increasingly aware of the powerful forces controlling it.
What Dr. Ochsner and Dr. Mary Sherman and David Ferry were doing was assembling various products that could be used by the CIA, perhaps by the Mafia, and they were involved with both, that could be used against Castro and against insurgents or mercenaries or groups that were communist that they felt were infiltrating Central and South America.
However, the cancer virus they intended for Castro was proving to be not potent enough. Young Judith came up with the answer.
I convinced Dr. Ochsner and others that the real thing we need to do is pull down Castro's immune system by using several ploys, and then when the cancer is introduced into his body, it would be found in his blood system. They'd put him in front of the X-ray again and again and again. He'd be injected again and again. Supposedly he'd be getting treatments to kill the cancer when actually his immune system is getting destroyed. That could be done. In other words, Castro could be eliminated by using the X-ray, and they'll think that it's the side effects from lung cancer. And that was my idea.
Judith and Lee felt intense pressure to succeed. They were horrified to learn that some of the sponsors of the Kill Castro program were also interested in getting rid of Kennedy because of his perceived failure to deal with the communist threat so close to America's shores.
We were aware of this through David Ferry, who had infiltrated groups who were planning or trying to kill Kennedy and or to kill Castro. By focusing on Cuba, if Castro were dead and taking over Cuba again, everybody would be satisfied. The military, the CIA, the Mafia, and other elements, the anti-Castroites. Everybody would be happy if Castro were out of the picture. Otherwise, it seemed that these people really basically were focused on eliminating Kennedy, and then they could do as they pleased with Cuba, with another administration. And a lot of these people had a lot of power. It was a frightening thing for me to hear about all these things.
But for Agent Oswald, the Kill Castro project was only one of several undercover assignments that summer, as Judith learned.
First of all, he and Guy Bannister went out and worked with students trying to uncover radicals that were on campus. This is very important. They were getting ready to leave for the summer, and Guy Bannister was convinced that these students would be agitators during the summer for pro-civil rights events and so on. On the other hand, as soon as these students left, which was at the end of May when school got out, Lee was then free, of course, to try and kind of polish up his pro-Castro end of things, because he was supposed to be a pro-Castro person eventually, to be groomed enough and to be able to enter Cuba if they ever wanted him to go to Cuba.
This alleyway behind Riley's had often provided Oswald with the means of slipping away unobserved to pursue these intelligence assignments. But by mid-July, those days were drawing to an end.
They needed an excuse to fire Lee because he'd actually fulfilled all the anti-Castro things he'd done with Guy Bannister and so on, and he was moving into a new phase, and that was to promote his pro-Castro image. That was going to be on television.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist, that is correct. But that does not mean, however, I'm a communist.
Pamphleteering, all kinds of things to make him look like a pro-Castro maniac, practically. And here he's working at Riley. This is a right-wing company. I mean, it would be a disaster. So, of course, they did not want Lee Oswald on the premises anymore.
Lee was fired on a pretext, and Judith soon followed because of her associations with him. But her hard work at the lab had paid off. The cancer virus required just one final test before it's dispatched to Cuba.
It was made clear to me, and I felt very badly about it, that human volunteers, so-called, would have to be relied upon to test the materials. When this was made, when I realized that this was happening, I had some ethical objections.
The plan was to bring prisoners to this Louisiana mental hospital from the Angola penitentiary 30 miles away. Here they would be injected with the cancer virus created to kill Castro, to prove its effectiveness.
Well, I did something I had been told not to do. I wrote a note to Dr. Ochsner, and I signed it with my initials, J.A., and in it I protested the use of human beings at this stage in the project under the grounds that these were unwitting volunteers. They were not aware that they were going to be injected with live cancer cells, and the goal was to kill them with it. And of course, they weren't going to be volunteering for that. So I did object, and Ochsner called me on the phone, and he was furious and said I never should have written anything that was linked to me by any kind of paper or handwriting or anything. If I had any objections, I should have told him in person. And he said at that time that both Lee and I were expendable. And then he slammed the phone down. By expendable, he meant, it was very clear to me and Lee both, that they could get rid of us at any time if we were going to cause problems, because this was a project that was much, much bigger than any little Lee Oswald or any little Judy Baker.
So, in late August, Oswald and Ferry arrived in the small town of Clinton, 130 miles from New Orleans, in a black Cadillac driven by Clay Shaw. Here they met a hospital orderly and awaited phone instructions on where to join the prison convoy, en route from Angola, bringing the volunteers to the nearby mental hospital at Jackson.
It was necessary for David Ferry to make the initial injections. There's a doctor up there who would be taking it on, but he had to be shown how to handle materials. That was the first thing, and David knew how to do injections. Secondly, Lee had to come along because he had learned all these special techniques to handle materials. He'd learned them in the lab working with me. And so, as the experiment was successful, he was selected as the ideal person to take these materials down to Mexico City, where they would be handed over to a contact, a medical student or a medical technician. And those materials would then be taken over to Cuba and handed over in Cuba to a member of Castro's medical team who could be trusted. So that's why Lee Oswald had to be there. Lee Oswald, the orderly, and Clay Shaw, and of course David Ferry entered into Jackson Mental Hospital behind the vehicle that was transporting these prisoners who were going to be injected. In they all went at the same time. The orderly that was with them that they had picked up outside of Clinton showed them where to go inside, and at that time those prisoners received the injections that were necessary to begin this terrible round of injections and X-ray, injections and X-ray that they hoped would actually kill these people.
Judith's ethical objections to the tests at Jackson had made an enemy of Alton Ochsner. But she was required for one final task. They needed to know if the cancer virus had taken.
This test had to be done within 72 hours, and on August 31st, 1963, Lee Oswald drove me up to Jackson. I was wearing my little white outfit, so I looked like a nurse type. I was taken by the orderly up through a freight elevator and then into this area. This person I was taken to see, who was one of the prisoners who had been injected, was in a bed by himself, and I noticed at once that he was thrashing about and he didn't even know where he was. He was quite ill already. This is only within 72 hours of being injected with this material and having been subjected to these high doses of X-ray. And I did finish my reports. I realized that the method, we had hit 100% here with this gentleman at least, and that he was responding as expected, and apparently the method was going to work.
But Alton Ochsner's anger at Judith was unabated, and he reneged on his promise of a place for her at Tulane Medical School. She now had no alternative but to leave New Orleans and Lee and return to Gainesville with her husband. But the young lovers were determined that their affair would not die. They met for the last time at their favorite hotel.
It was a time of grief and a time of great joy too, because just being with each other in privacy, and we were able to put some of our dreams out there, lay them on the table and say, how can we meet? How can we get together again? How are we going to handle this? This was not goodbye, this was au revoir. We wanted very much to meet again, not only meet again, but to marry. And we were adamant in these hopes of ours. Neither of us wanted to stay the long term with the mate that we presently had. Both of us felt quite neglected by them. Lee told me about a city called Merida that was down in the Yucatan Peninsula that had CIA contacts located there, and that we would find a way to meet in Merida and get married there. And it was the last time I saw him in the flesh, except for a brief glance at him the next day when we pulled out of town, heading toward Fort Walton Beach, Robert's parents' home. And Lee is standing there in the corner. He's dressed in flip-flops and a pair of plain pants and a white T-shirt, and he's reading a newspaper. And he lowers the newspaper, and I'm looking into his eyes as the car turns a corner, and it's the last time I saw him face to face.
At Jackson, within a month of Judith's departure, the first prisoner injected with cancer died. She later learned Oswald traveled to Mexico City in late September to hand over the deadly materials intended for Castro. But his trip was a catastrophe. The drop for the flasks containing the serum was a souvenir shop, but no one showed. Even his main CIA contact, a mysterious Mr. B, had suddenly left for Washington.
He began to do everything he said he possibly could think of that might make him get a chance to meet someone who would be able to take the material from him. And he said at the last, if that didn't work, he even tried to figure out ways himself to get into Cuba because he felt he had enough credentials he might be able to pull it off.
Frantic efforts in Mexico City to secure a Cuban transit visa failed, and a disillusioned Oswald returned to the USA in early October. In Dallas, his handlers told him that Hurricane Flora had brought chaos to Cuba, and the mission to murder Castro had been aborted. He was given new orders.
He would be getting a job, just like he had at Riley. It was all set up in advance at this particular building known today as the Texas School Book Depository building.
In the weeks before the assassination, Lee was still able to confide in Judith, thanks to David Ferry.
He did manage to set up through the Mafia a special phone line using their racing telephone lines that they had between Miami and Dallas. And that was perfectly free. We didn't have to spend a nickel. During the 14 or 15 telephone calls that Lee and I exchanged, most of them to me, these calls lasting about an hour to an hour and 45 minutes, the tone of the conversations as time wore on got more and more desperate in a way. Lee was penetrating a ring that he had gotten introduced into by David Ferry and Clay Shaw, and Lee put on the robes of one who was interested in sincerely assassinating the president, and this was not ever the case in reality. It was pretty well known to me by just a little bit before the assassination that Dealey Plaza and the airport and the Trade Mart were the three sites that they were going to try and kill Kennedy. If they didn't get him at one, it'd be at one of the others. He didn't know that he might be at Dealey Plaza itself. He even told me the second last phone call we had that they might call him and ask him to go somewhere else at lunchtime or something. And the they I'm talking about became more and more indistinct to him because every time he met one or two of them, it was somebody he didn't know.
Kennedy's arrival in Dallas was now only 5 days away.
When Lee called me on Sunday, November 17th, this was a very harrowing call for me. I'm talking to a man who says, don't feel sorry for me. You've got to understand that this is fulfilling a dream. I might be able to save the president. And he said, that's worth dying for. He said, I'm not scared to die so much. I'm just scared about leaving my kids behind and they'll think maybe I did it because they're going to try to blame me. Now he's talking this way on Sunday. He had the idea that he never probably would have lived a long time because I said, you know, it's like an oak tree. You're just getting started in your life. And he said, no. He said, I'm like a lily. He said, that's beautiful too. Okay. Anyway, he said, just please don't feel sorry for me. I might have a chance to save the president. And that was so important to him in every way.
On Wednesday, November 20th, 1963, Judith, frantic with worry, called Lee at his workplace, the Texas School Book Depository. He returned her call that evening from a payphone, less than 38 hours before Kennedy's assassination.
Our last conversation that lasted over an hour and a half, Lee was trying to assure me that he was not alone, and that there was at least one other person, perhaps two, that were involved with him in this matter, who were trying to save the president. It's like one group is trying to kill and the other group is going to try to abort. But he made clear to me there wasn't any way that he could actually remove himself from the situation into which he had penetrated. He almost rejoiced that he had been able to penetrate it. It was something that fulfilled him in a way, because it meant that he had fulfilled the function that he had always wanted to be, and that is somebody who might be able to make a tremendous difference if he could succeed somehow in saving the president. On the other hand, if he had removed himself, his wife, his little girl, his little baby, me, the people he loved, we would have been slaughtered. We would have been eliminated. And of course he would have died anyway. He was in too deep. He couldn't withdraw. It was too late. And then he said, if I stay, there'll be one less bullet fired at Kennedy. And my heart just turned over, because I thought that was such a courageous thing to say. And then he said, you know, look at all the people who have kids. He said, you're smart and you love children. He says, please have children for me. Have babies. Please have babies for me. So I had 5. I had 5 babies. And he said that, I can't go on right now. In the final minutes of our call, he gave me some of the concerns he had. The most he had been able to find out that there was a connection between the assassination and persons whose names were Billy Solestes and Bobby Baker. Not that they were directly involved, but because of them. He said never to forget their names, and that this was a big event going on at that time in Dallas about them.
Bobby Baker was a corrupt business associate of Vice President Lyndon Johnson. So was Billy Solestes. Investigations into their financial misdealings were threatening to put Johnson behind bars.
And then he said, you know how we've tried and worried about who in the world my handler was. Mr. B, Mr. Bishop, or Benson, or whatever, Benton. He said, I think it's David Atlee Phillips. He said, and I don't want you to forget it. He said, you've got to remember that name.
Phillips was a high-ranking CIA official in Mexico City in charge of covert action at the time of Oswald's visit there. His connections to the assassination have long been suspected.
And then he told me goodbye. And we were both crying. And I told him I'd never forget it as long as he lived. And he said that might be only until tomorrow. He could crack jokes right to the end. And of course I meant it as long as I lived. So that's the way it was. And I wondered how I'm going to keep my mouth shut, and I knew if I said a word, it could be so dangerous for him. And I just prayed to God he'd make it. And then he said, would you pray for me? And here he's an atheist, and I didn't believe in God anymore either. So I said an Our Father with him. And he said, I love you, Judufki. I hung up. That's all. That's it.
Less than 90 minutes after the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested in the Oak Cliff district of Dallas for the murder of a policeman, J.D. Tippit. 12 hours later, he was charged with the murder of President Kennedy. That evening, Judith in Gainesville received a frantic call from David Ferry in New Orleans.
Dave said to me, you have to keep your mouth shut and your head down. He said, I know you're an emotional person. He said, I'm an emotional person. He started really losing it a little bit. And he said, everything's gone wrong. I'm really concerned that, maybe things won't go right, but you've just got to hold on to the hope that we're going to get him out of there. And he said, and I swear to you, I think he said, I swear on a stack of Bibles, or I swear on my life, I am going now. I'm going to go all the way to Houston. I'm going to drive all the way there, go to that little airport at Alief, pick him up, and we'll go over to Hull Field. He'll get on the plane there, and he said, my boys will drive my car back to New Orleans, and I'll fly him to Laredo. He said, even if Lee didn't make it to Alief, even so, he'd be able to find out what was really going to happen to Lee, because he had so many contacts. And just trust him and hang on and keep my mouth shut. And then he slammed the phone down.
On the morning of Sunday, November 24th, Oswald was to be moved from the Dallas City Jail, where he had been kept since his arrest, to the greater security of the county jail. The event was televised across the nation. In Florida, Judith was watching.
As I watched, and I'm thinking, they're transferring him. I knew he hadn't made it to the airport. He's been accused of killing the president. And I'd seen over and over again some of the press conferences and things, and I saw how much weight Lee had lost, and how thin he'd gotten. I saw the bruise on his eye and the cut on him, and I knew who knows how they're punching him, and the whole thing was, to me, I could see he was just being mauled around, and I knew he wasn't being treated right. So I was feeling horrible, and then I saw him come out, and he's got a nice black sweater on, and he's been shaved, and he looks nice. And my heart turned. I thought, oh, at last they're going to treat him better. And then they shot him.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's a man with a gun. Absolute panic.
I think I don't know what happened to me. I don't remember anything literally for hours after he was shot, and I was trying to see what happened, and my friend, I think, started to scream. I think I was crying, and I knew he was dead. For the first time and only time in my life, I wanted to kill myself. I didn't want to live anymore.
Almost 2 weeks after Lee's murder, Ferry called Judith from New Orleans for the last time, warning her she would die if she ever revealed what she knew.
He reminded me that the good friend of Godfather of New Orleans, who was Carlos Marcello, that good friend Santos Traficante, was watching to see how I was behaving, and that I'm to keep my mouth shut. And he also told me I could no longer expect to shine in any area. I'm not to have any more nice little news clippings or make straight A's or any of that, because I had to be a vanilla girl and be a nobody and keep my head down and make no waves if I wanted to stay alive. He abruptly ended the call, told me he could never contact me again. He told me that I was never to speak about any of this to anybody again, for all our own goods. And I never spoke to anybody about anything because I didn't want to die. No more science work, no more trying to help anybody, no more trying to cure cancer. Everything had gone wrong, everything. That's it.
Judith kept her secret for 40 years, but with her children grown up, she finally decided to break her silence before it was too late.
It's been a huge embarrassment to my family, to my children, a shock to them. I've always raised them to be very moral, and here their mother is saying that she was the mistress of an alleged assassin of the President of the United States. I want to make it clear that I'm making this statement at cost to me personally and to my family, but that it is the right thing to do because Lee Oswald is an innocent man, and my only and sole desire is to see his name cleared.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet.
Oswald, did you shoot the president?
I didn't shoot anybody, sir. I haven't been told what I'm here for.
You have a lawyer?
No, sir, I don't. I do request for someone to come forward to give me a legal assistance.